Thank you for joining us. I had imagined this as sort of a perhaps a less uh, uh, elegant and articulate version of Krista Tippett's On Being, because she's such a master at this. But to have a chance to have a conversation with you, Galen, about your book and whatever else we come across. We're not going to go around and introduce ourselves, but after we spend a little bit of our time together with some Q&A and some questions that I have for Galen, then we'll open it up for your questions, comments, conversation. How does all that sound? Good. So I want to introduce you, and there's much I could say about you, Galen, but you are a noted author. I like to think of you as a public theologian as well, and I know you as a writer. You've also also talk about your fact that you're a husband to Holly, a father to Zoe, and I have to say this. I know that you said don't say this, Galen, but on the inside of your book, you are one of the charismatic, brilliant leaders of one of the nation's most prominent Unitarian Universalist congregations, which, of course, you are visiting another one of.
Indeed. Among another brilliant and charismatic. By the way, as I told Kathleen when she threatened to say this out loud and I told her she couldn't, what I said to her was, I'm responsible for what's in the book. I'm not responsible for what's on the book. So there you go. I take no credit or blame. So that's my position, and I'm not moving from it.
Sticking to it. Great. Well, let me just say, I felt like this book came at the right time. I know it was published in May, I think, right? It came out in May.
Yep.
Yeah, and as I was looking through books to buy and thinking about, of course, this Sunday, I felt like it was really timely. So I was thinking about your book in the fact that it's in part spiritual and theological reflection and in part autobiography. Mm-hmm. And one of the hymns that we sing every Sunday at All Souls is the Spirit of Life, Roots and Wings. And one of the things I was struck by was you write about the Mennonite faith of your childhood as both the roots of your spiritual development and Unitarian Universalism, as I would like to think of that as wings. And so I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how your Mennonite faith influenced your spiritual development. And for those especially who haven't read the book. And I just remembered, Galen, I was actually going to give you some time just to talk before I start asking you questions. So feel free to riff.
I'm open to either of those options. But let me start by, first of all, saying thank you to you, Kathleen, and to your congregation for this invitation and opportunity. It's wonderful to be with you for various reasons, most of them having to do with COVID. We haven't been able to spend as much time together as we normally would have under these circumstances. So it's wonderful to be with you in this context. I did grow up conservative Mennonite, a group that's sort of halfway between the regular Mennonites and the Amish. So it was a fairly austere, somewhat cloistered upbringing. And I didn't leave formally until I was in my mid-20s, though there were signs much earlier than that a rupture would eventually come. And I guess what I would say about this book and its relationship to my Mennonite upbringing is that I didn't initially set out to write a book on gratitude. I set out to write a book that would address some of the same questions that were always answered for me in the first part of my life by the Bible, which is to say, what is really true and what is truly real. And in my upbringing, the answer to that question was, well, look in the Bible, because that's kind of the definitive revelation of everything you most need to know, and our most secure source of guidance about how we ought to live our lives. So for reasons that I detail in the book, I eventually decided to leave, mainly because I didn't ultimately believe that the Bible was the one repository of what is most really true and truly real. But having grown up in an environment where something played that role, then the question became, if the Bible doesn't play that role, what does? What is most really true and what is most truly real? And the fact that you shift from revelation to reason or from scripture to science doesn't actually answer all the questions. I mean, the periodic table is a magnificent human creation, but it doesn't tell you how to live your life on a day-to-day basis. It doesn't tell you how to make hard choices. So I began a journey to try to find a way to articulate what, for me at least, is what is most really true about the world we live in. And then in light of that, to ask myself, so what principles should I use in figuring out how I should live? So the result is basically clustered around, I would say, three realizations. One is that everything in the universe is made of relationships. And this is literally true. If you take the material substance that makes up the universe and squish it all together, you literally get a handful of stuff. Everything else is relationships. If you begin to take relationships seriously, then it seems to me the spiritual challenge is to open ourselves to the truth about the relationships that make us up as individuals, our relationships to other people, our relationships to the natural world. But in the normal course of life, that's not what we tend to pay attention to. We focus on what we have to do. And that tends to insulate us from these questions about what these relationships mean. People tend to play instrumental roles. They're in our lives mainly for what they can do for us, not as a kind of relationship. So that focus on relationships and then openness, to me, leads to the third point, which is the presence of possibility. It seems to me that only when you are honest with yourself about what is really true and what is truly real about your own life and about the world, you open yourself to that, can you really see what authentic possibilities lie ahead? So possibility is kind of the final element, which is not just an openness to the present, but an openness to the future. And I think one of the things that my Mennonite background continually reinforced not only was kind of a longing for finding a new way to understand my life, but also a sense that the relationships, the human relationships, the relationships with the natural world — I grew up on a farm — are what constitutes the important arena of life. And I very much bring that to my work as a Unitarian Universalist minister. I think Unitarian Universalists and Mennonites are kind of at the opposite end of the spectrum when it comes to individuality and community. And it's been my conviction for a long time that where we actually belong is somewhere in the middle. I think Unitarian Universalists tend to be too individualist for our own good and for other people's good. And I think Mennonites tend to be too communitarian for their own good. So it's that tension that has kind of informed an important strand in my ministry.
Well, and that's certainly woven throughout the book. All the threads that you just mentioned, you have a deep love of science and appreciation for it. for the theology and philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, who, of course, is all about relationships and process, and then this deep appreciation for the intimate relationships in your life that are so close. So I really appreciated that this is not just it's not an intellectual memoir. It is. It almost has a mystical edge to it, and I wonder if that label has ever been something that you have been attracted to or felt as an aspect of your own theological orientation.
I think you're the first person, Kathleen, who has ever thought I might be trending toward mysticism. But I something in me likes that a lot. So this is what I think, that, I started out college in mathematics because I figured if there's anything you can count on, it's 1 + 1 = 2. By the way, no one has ever been able to prove addition, but nonetheless, it still seems fairly secure. And that study, I mean, it's ironic. I went on to major in classics, classical philosophy and poetry, and then, did a couple of other degrees. But I ended up studying Alfred North Whitehead, as you say, who himself started out as a mathematician. He wrote Principia Mathematica with Bertrand Russell. And the interesting thing is that if you talk to mathematicians and physicists who are at the highest levels of those disciplines, they're extraordinarily mystical in their understanding of life and human life and the universe. And it seems to me that the more we know, the more we are aware of our profound ignorance about almost everything. And so to recognize that there are lots of things that we don't understand, that there are connections and presences and powers in our lives and in our world that influence us in ways that we don't understand. I think that level of openness is something that has really developed in me. I grew up a straight white male in a very repressed environment. And I've spent pretty much all my life trying to get out of that box. And, I'm modestly successful occasionally and not at all sometimes. But I think that longing for a more, an openness to the mystery that lies not only within us, but among us and around us is a profound longing.
One of the quotes in your book that I just love, that I think is what inspired me to ask you about mysticism, was, if facts are the musical notes on the page, then spirituality is the music they create. And also knowing that you have, I don't know if you still consider yourself a musician, but that has been part of your own spiritual practice, I would imagine.
Yeah.
So I love that that balance, or that the intersection of facts, which historically Unitarian Universalists have always revered, but then spirituality is the music they create. I wonder if you could just say a little bit about that sentence.
Well, I think, to me, spirituality is not about any particular part of life. You can't set spirituality alongside, say, we have our physical lives as human beings, we have our educational life, we have our work life, we have our leisure time, we have, the food we eat and the relationships, and we have our economic life, our political life, our social justice life, and all of these things are parts of our lives. But to me, spirituality is not one of those aspects of life, but rather how all of those aspects of life relate to each other and how they all ultimately need to work together in order for us to have a life that is meaningful and purposeful and filled with joy. So I think describing it as music um, leaves us free to say that if those various elements of life are colliding with each other, are at odds with each other, then the dissonance is pretty ugly to watch and pretty ugly to listen to. And one of the things we do in spiritual communities is we talk about how all of those aspects of life fit together, which is why I often say that when you enter a sanctuary for a service of worship, absolutely everything is in play. Um, you know, people will hear me from the pulpit talking about absolutely anything, because to me, spirituality is about everything and how all of the pieces fit together.
Mhm. Well, I think that's one of the gifts of this particular faith tradition. It's certainly one of the reasons why I was attracted to Unitarian Universalism, is that nothing is beyond our lens and
Right.
our study and reflection. Um, as we were talking, I was thinking about the song, the hymn that we sang this morning at All Souls. It's one of my favorites. It's "For all that is our life, we give our
Mhm.
thanks and praise. For all life is a gift, which we are called to use to build the common good." And so this goes to another question, a question about uh, gratitude in all things. And I've heard this question posed to me as well. Um, one obvious question, and I suppose you get this too, is gratitude is a stance, gratitude is a decision we make. And yet, what about all of the hard things that are in our lives? What about COVID? Are we really grateful for COVID? Are we grateful for some of the terrible things that have happened to us or happened to our world? How do we square wanting to be grateful and have that stance and that attitude in the world with the challenges and some of the truly evil things that also come our way? So
Very
how
good.
you've been asked that question, I'm sure, and how do you respond to something like that?
Well, I think there's a sense in which I'm trying to spiritualize the idea, the concept, the experience of gratitude. And I think a good analogy is how we talk about love
Mm,
and the many ways we talk about love. Uh, we talk about love in the way that the band Aerosmith talks about in their song Love in the Elevator. We talk about love as the kind of friendship that develops between two people. We talk about parental love. We talk about sacrificial love.
mm,
And we talk about the kind of love that gives with no expectation in return that we often refer to as divine love. So to me, gratitude is like love in that respect. And saying thank you when somebody does something nice for you, to me, is on the spectrum, but it's kind of on the simplistic end of the spectrum. But ultimately, to me, living with gratitude is not necessarily, and maybe not ever, always feeling grateful, because it's ultimately not about how we feel. It's about a recognition that each moment and each day comes to us as a gift from sources beyond ourselves, over which, in many cases, we have no control. But just to be here, just to have a new day dawn, is an opportunity that is presented to us, a once in a lifetime opportunity this day represents. So to me, living with gratitude is a commitment to live in a particular way in light of all that is past and all that is present, as well as all that is possible. And that experience, to me, is the experience of living with gratitude. And sometimes we feel grateful, especially when good things happen. And sometimes we don't feel grateful when bad things happen. Just like sometimes we feel loving, even toward people we love, and sometimes we don't feel loving toward them. So I think that's the best analogy for how I understand gratitude as a way of life that kind of separates it somewhat from just a way of feeling thankful.
Yeah, I thought that was very insightful and helpful in your book. And in fact, I spoke about that in the sermon today, the difference between a feeling and a decision. Because as you also say in your book, we often can't really control our feelings.
Right.
And that was where I sort of thought, well, I should be able to change this feeling, but I can make a decision. I can make a decision about how I'm going to approach every single moment.
Right.
And that I do have control over. Um, and that's why I feel like this practice of gratitude as a spiritual practice is one that's particularly helpful for folks in our faith tradition, since it is accessible to all at every minute of every day.
Right.
And I think it does change lives. Um, and Yeah, I was going to ask you how that has changed your life, although I could just say people could also read your book. I mean, I'm curious if you could. It's not like weren't grateful, didn't experience gratitude, and now you're Mr. Grateful and you've written a book about it. But is there sort of a moment in your own life or experience where you notice this shift happening in you and you realize that this has become your spirit, one of your primary spiritual practices?
Well, I think it's obviously been a lifelong path. I mean, I've been wrestling with this question, the question of how shall we live and how shall we understand how we live. And, ultimately growing up Mennonite, my life was pretty simple at the theological level. You want to know how to live, read the Bible and do what it says. I mean, it's pretty simple. And, there are things that the Bible doesn't deal with, but there are a lot of things that it does. And so I think the idea that we as human beings at some level are, things have to be pretty simple, particularly if we are going to incorporate them into our way of life every day and not just kind of parachute in for an hour each Sunday and, think in a certain way during that hour. What's a way of life and how do we capture it? How do we articulate it? And how do we keep it front and center in our lives so that it will actually make a difference in not only how we think, but in how we live? And so the development of the hallmarks of gratitude and the gratitude goals that goal that comes out of each one of them was for me an effort to put in fairly simple terms the principles of life as I understand them, so that I could kind of like walk around with them and make decisions that would have a better chance of resonating with what I actually believe. I think for me, the biggest difference that it has made is in two directions. One is, given the fact that I was born sunny side up, um, I'm always looking for the good news, right? Um, somebody else can bother with the bad news. That was my basic view of life. But what I realized is that nothing is going to change in my life or my world if I am honest with myself about what's really the case.
Mm.
If it's bad news, I'm better off knowing it because it's a part of my world. And if something difficult or bad is a part of my world and I act like it's not there, it's going to rise up and bite me. So I think when I tended to resist hearing bad news, dealing with difficult things, particularly emotional things, I talk, as you mentioned, about kind of some of my personal relationships and how I've learned to deal with difficult things. I think that for me is a real something that really has changed in my life as a result of thinking about life in terms of gratitude. And the other is then the focus on possibility, and to say it doesn't matter how difficult things are at the moment, how bad I feel, how badly I've screwed up. The question is, something has to come next. What's that going to be? And sometimes the next thing that happens can be either a good thing or something that's at least a little better than what happened before. So being attuned to possibility, what can I do now that will make my life and the world just a little better? Not a big change, but a small change. And that focus on what I can do here and now, where I am, as I am, to make my life, someone else's life, the world a little bit better. That also has been a discipline that's developed as a result of thinking about life in terms of gratitude.
Yeah, and I think the practice, the spiritual practice, helps us develop the capacity for dealing with the hard things and to be able to be more emotionally resilient and not live in a state of denial. And I really love the at the end of your book, you have a spiritual practice. You have some suggestions for spiritual practice that are very accessible, with short readings, and the encouragement that folks do that on a regular basis. You talk about the importance of practice, and how, as I said, I think it helps us deepen our capacity to deal with, as the Buddhists say, old age, sickness, and death. Because that's going to come to all of us.
It
and
is.
Part of this is also, what does it mean to be a spiritually mature person? And I mean, that's what I'm going to church for. That's what I believe our folks, those of you on this call, are interested in. What does it mean to be spiritually mature and grounded? So to that point of spiritual practice, I do have to ask you, in your book, you talk about two spiritual practices. One's a food fast, a fast from food once a month, and one is a digital fast. I got to tell you, that one I went, oh no, you mean no cell phone for 24 hours? So seriously, I just have to know, what's the real skinny? Do you actually do that?
Um, Let me just comment about the kind of spiritual practice question. And I think, to
Sure.
me, spiritually mature people are people who realize that you never actually become spiritually mature. You simply have to stay at the practice. I think one of the things that has often struck me about the Unitarian Universalist approach to spirituality is that it's sort of like immaculately conceived, coming out of nowhere, and it takes nothing. Um, when in fact, I mean, I was a violinist for many years. If you want to become a good violinist, you have to practice. And there are no alternatives to that. And I think the same is true with spirituality. If you want to be a deeply grounded person, if you want to have a clear sense of who you are and what you're committed to, and continually keep yourself aware of those commitments and how they affect your own life and the people and world around you, you have to keep reminding yourself. You have to keep that practice in mind. So during COVID, I think my life has obviously changed dramatically as a lot of other people's lives have changed. And I've actually found the media fast to be easier than before. I must confess, I do not turn my cell phone completely off ever. Um, and I think, particularly given my role and responsibilities in life, but what I do tell my staff and the board and congregational leaders is there are times that I don't look at my email. And so if you need to reach me, call me. And they do. So I can ignore my email and, not look at media or social media for a day and not feel like I'm in danger of losing anything. In fact, I think it's true to say that one of the ways that I have uh, remained emotionally resilient during this period of time is significantly dialing down the amount of time I spend watching and reading uh, media, social media, um, because I find it kind of enervating.
Mhm.
And I realized that in order to um, be responsibly engaged in the world, I need to stay relatively well informed. But it doesn't mean that I have to be bombarded with the minutia about what's going on every single minute. So I've actually dialed down significantly my media consumption. The the food fast is what I've done more of recently is I think what is called intermittent fasting, which is easier to incorporate in a life that is closely shared with other people. So, not eating for 16 or 20 hours at a stretch, which seems more doable. Um, Although I do think there is great value, and I have found great value in longer periods of time. But spiritual practices need to adapt to our changes in circumstances. And, they don't work in the same form for everybody, which is why there is such a variety of them. But they have both of those have been important to me to feel like in a time when so many things seem out of control, that at least I'm able to control some things.
Mhm.
And most importantly, to control myself.
Well, I was intrigued with the idea of the fast because the few times that I have undertaken different fasts, the byproduct of that is a deeper sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the way that food tastes, that the things that I'd taken for granted, food, the quality of food, slowing down, acknowledging the gifts and all that went into this. I mean, so it's an opportunity to deepen our sense of gratitude.
Yeah.
Um, and same thing with the media fast. I will say I haven't actually done a full media fast, but I too have had to dial back because the word is enervating, draining, exhausting. And, how do we in this world find ways to stay centered, grounded, and grateful
Mhm.
is, I think, our spiritual task. Um, I'm wondering if this might be a good time to open it up to see if there are some other questions or if there was anything else you wanted to add before we did that.
Let's go to questions.
All right. So I'm thinking what we'll do is if you have a question or comment, just unmute yourself, tell us your name, and I think I'm grateful to have Rose on this call in case we need some help with navigating. But otherwise, I would love to hear from you. And again, it doesn't have to be a question for Galen. It could be a comment or just a thought. Let's see. I have two screens here. Oh, and people can raise their hand too. That's right. That's right.
Or if you prefer, you could probably, the chat is on, right? So you could put a question in the chat.
Right.
Yes, you could type questions in the chat as well.
There we go. Yeah. Yeah, and as you're thinking about what you've just heard, I don't assume that everyone's read the book, but of course these themes are beyond any one book or any one sermon. And
Let me just add one note on the, and I meant to mention this earlier, is that I have found this way of thinking and living extremely useful during this time. And those of you who have read the book will notice that the faceplate of the book is a quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And it's very short. It reads, "In ordinary life, we hardly realize that we receive a great deal more than we give, and that it is only with gratitude that life becomes rich." And the irony of that statement is that Bonhoeffer wrote that from Tegel Prison in 1943. He, though a pacifist, had participated in a plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler. The plot failed, and he and some of the other conspirators were put in Tegel Prison, sentenced to death. He was ultimately executed about 6 weeks before the Allies liberated the prison. But here he is in prison under a death sentence, almost certainly would not reappear absent a miracle. And yet his experience of life is that it is only with gratitude that life becomes rich. And I just think it's such a wonderful testimony to the way in which gratitude can shore us up, even in our most difficult moments in life.
thank you. Erica?
Thank you so much. And I did read the book last summer when it came out, because I remembered your wonderful series about virtue at General Assembly a few years ago. That was great. I guess I have more of a comment than a question. I wouldn't mind if you said more, though, because I grew up Lutheran, but very evangelical Lutheran, with grandparents that did believe all answers were in the Bible, and I would be directed to find all my answers in the Bible. So I'm on a journey, I think, to be okay. I don't need to have the Bible as my Bible, but your book is helpful in thinking of other places to find answers. So I don't know if you have any more to say about that, but you've already raised it, but I just wanted to comment that's helpful for those of us that have been very constricted in our growing up, which may even be true of some people that grew up with no religion. I don't know, and need to find a path.
Well, I think it is true that if you look at where people go when they leave very rigid religious traditions, they often land in the land of freedom for a while, but in many cases revert to a different form of religious authoritarianism or fundamentalism. And I think that's because freedom is a widely misunderstood concept. I subscribe to the view of, freedom from bondage, of course, or from slavery, or from captivity, or from addiction, or whatever. That's one kind of freedom. But the glorification of freedom as my ability to do whatever I want to do and be whatever I want to do, make my own rules, make my own way, pull myself up by my own bootstraps, is really not only is it a pipe dream, but it's something of a spiritual death sentence in my view, because it really does isolate us from other people. And, I like the line that Chris Christopherson wrote for Janis Joplin: freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose.
Mm.
And so I think whether we come from no tradition or a very rigid tradition, we do need to find a place where we fit in, where the people around us and the institutions around us support us in ways that enable us to live lives of meaning and purpose, which is why I've always struggled in some ways with parts of the Unitarian Universalist tradition, which insist that theology and spirituality are simply an individual undertaking, the build your own theology approach. My own view is that if we have nothing much to offer people in those areas, then we have nothing much to offer people. So I think being a part of a community of faith that knows how it understands itself, knows what its place is in the lives of its members and friends and in the life of the larger community, I think that's essential.
I'm going to invite, thank you. And thank you, Erica. I'm going to invite Kurt to ask his question, and then Wayne, and then there's 2 questions on the chat.
Hello, Galen. It's very excellent to see you after many, many years.
Great to see you, Kurt.
I did read the book, which I found just excellent, very inspiring. And I kind of took 3 action things away from it. The first was kind of the balance or overcoming regret and thinking about gratitude, which just struck me as more interesting even than the kind of balance between anger and gratitude. But the regret is an interesting challenge. And the second was the issue of gratitude and reciprocity. Mm-hmm. And the third was just the overarching challenge of making gratitude genuine, which comes to the practice. But those 3, I thought the most interesting and counterintuitive or difficult to envision what it really meant was gratitude and reciprocity. And I wonder if you could talk a little more about how one conceptualizes that as a life practice, especially because that starts to get us towards the questions of social justice, as you do in your book and the like.
Well, I think there's a relatively simple way to understand reciprocity, and it comes with an awareness of what we require from the people and world around us in order to live the lives we live. And if we step back and kind of look at our lives and what make them up, we become keenly aware that we really can't do anything on our own, that everything we eat and drink and wear and do and own and ride and sit on and work on and play with, everything requires not just other random individuals, but entire legions of people and industries to make those things possible. So if you understand life as a vast network of relationships, economic relationships, supply chain relationships, then I think you become aware that there are an awful lot of things inbound. And in order for me to live my life as I live it, a lot of other people have to do the work that they have been called to do or they have decided to do. Everything from if I want something to happen when I turn a light switch on to if I want something to be in the refrigerator when I open it up. And that I too am a part of that vast network of reciprocity. So I have my part to play. And I have a different kind of part. And one of the things that I think this way of understanding things allows us to see is that in important ways, there aren't 2 kinds of work. The kind of work that is sort of spiritual and focuses on the important things in life, and then the kind of work that is kind of more commercial or materialistic. In my view, both are equally important so that we can live a meaningful and fulfilling life. We need food to eat. We need medicines. We need electricity. We need all of these things. And somebody has to tend to those so that those of us who do other things can do the other things we do. So that reciprocity to me is just kind of built into the nature of things. But because of our myth of individualism and our kind of self-centered focus, we just tend to let that escape from our awareness.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to call on Wayne Arnason now.
Yeah, nice to see you, Galen.
Good to see you, Wayne.
I think my question meshes nicely with Kurt's, because I was thinking about gratitude as becoming aware of your dependence and interdependence on on both the natural world and all that the human world does to make our lives possible. But is the other direction of that, the outward response to that, is that maybe best described as compassion? The deeper that your capacity for and your choices for gratitude become, the more you, I think, more deeply understand what compassion means as an active outward practice, giving it back. It's another way of describing the reciprocity.
I think that's, I think it will increase our compassion. I wouldn't probably want to say that our ethical relationship to the people in the world around us is based on compassion. I guess to me, compassion is, unless you understand compassion the way I'm talking about gratitude, and the religious traditions talk about love, which is to say compassion is not a matter of feeling in a certain way, but it is a matter of acting in a certain way. So with that caveat, I think, yes, gratitude, living with gratitude definitely will increase our level of compassion, because we see how much other people need what we can offer in the same way that they see what we can offer. And so I think in that sense, compassion is very much a part of our response. I think of it as, if there's a discipline of gratitude that reminds us of how much we rely on the people in the world around us, then it's an ethic of gratitude that reminds us of what our obligations are in return. So I like to talk about reciprocity outbound in terms of kind of the ethical life and in terms of our obligations. So it's not kind of optional or not subject to how we happen to be feeling at the moment. But it certainly does increase our sense of compassion to realize how much other people rely on us.
Thank you.
Well, this is a question from Barry in the chat, and she writes, how to be grateful when very angry at the current president and feeling powerless to make a difference. And so that's a challenge, isn't it?
Well, I think that is a challenge. And, I spent a lot of time in the past 4 years talking about it from the pulpit and elsewhere, how to deal with that. So I think a couple of things. One is that I don't think we ought to give Donald Trump any more credit than he deserves. Donald Trump did not create the problems that became that kind of came to a flashpoint with his candidacy for president. He gave people permission to talk about how they felt deeply in a way that people had not before. But he didn't invent, in my view, he did not invent, for the most part, those feelings in those people. They felt that way anyway. So to me, it's a part of what we have been doing in our country in a number of areas. We've been listening in a different way to women. We have been listening in a different way to gay people. We have been listening in a different way to people on the opposite end of the political spectrum from us, or if we're more centrist on, one or the other end. So I think the openness to recognize the pain and the problems that are present in our culture is a real opportunity. And Donald Trump, in that sense, is only a figurehead. He is not the substance of the problem. None of these problems will disappear when he leaves office. They will still remain, and in fact, they might get worse in the short run. So what I try to talk about is the fact that, there are abhorrent people in the world, and there are sexist people and misogynist people and bigoted people and racist people. And in my view, he's one of them. But there are lots of others. So, and he's done a lot of damage, some of which will endure. And it's a part of the brokenness of life, and it's a part of brokenness of our world. But in my view, we can't choose to engage only when we see that there will be a good outcome. I believe we are called to do whatever we can to bend the arc of the universe toward justice, no matter the outcome, even if things end up worse after we do our best than they are before we start. Our task is not to complete the work, but we are not free to abandon it. So I think we need to do what we can and work with other like-minded people and recognize that the world's a broken place. But by the way, if the world weren't a broken place and we as human beings weren't in some ways significantly broken, people like Kathleen and Wayne and I would be out of work, and places like All Souls would have no reason to exist. If everybody was the kind of person they ought to be and did the kind of thing they ought to do, we wouldn't need places like this. So lots of work for us to do.
So before I call on Lenore, this reminds me of that famous line from Fiddler on the Roof, where the rabbi in the town is approached. "Rabbi, is there a blessing for the czar?" "A blessing for the czar," he says. "Of course there is. A blessing for everything. May the Lord bless and keep the czar far away from us." So I feel the same way about this president. Far away from us.
Well, we at least have the advantage of most of the time being further away than you are. So there you go.
That's true. We're in the belly of the beast here. Lenore, love to hear from you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Enjoying this. And thanks for bringing the humor into it. I was going to ask the role of humor, but that's not my question. In the most popular course in the history of Harvard University ever is a course that was started in 2006, and immediately 1,400 of these extremely privileged young people, brilliant, every opportunity in the world, went running to this. It wasn't called gratitude, but it was called positive psychology. And my question is, so what took so long? When should we start teaching this? Are you going to write a book on gratitude for children? I know when I was a child, they tried to do that. Oh, you should be happy about what you're eating. Children in Africa are suffering, but that somehow didn't work. It didn't move anything. So have you given thought to this? When and how do parents bring this into children's lives in a way so that it doesn't leave them adrift until they're in their 20s, 30s, or 40s, until they wake up and say, oh, okay, here's how I find my bearings.
I was asked a question very similar to that last week in a podcast interview, a podcast I had not been aware of, but obviously should have been called The God Show. And I'm not sure what the term God applies to or where God lives in this show. But anyway, and my response then, as it is now, is that I think there are three things parents can do to try to instill in their children a sense both of gratitude, but also of reciprocity. And the three things are set an example, set an example, set an example. I think kids are far too busy watching what the adults around them are doing to listen to a word they say. And so I think if children grow up in an environment where the adults around them, particularly parents, live the kind of life, practice the discipline of gratitude, practice the ethic of reciprocity, that it doesn't guarantee anything. The role of media and social media and the market, as in some cases, we've often referred to them as the second parent. In many cases, they are now the first parent, is, in my view, tragic. It's a huge social experiment, and looking at the evidence in the psychological literature of depression and suicide among young people exactly tracks the rise in screen time. So that's a huge problem. So I think some of the media fast business that is good for us as adults is also good for kids. It's extremely difficult to pull that off with kids these days. I am aware of that. But I think as important is our willingness to live the kind of lives that we want our kids to emulate. And I think being honest with them about the challenges and struggles, but clear about our commitments, about our discipline, and about our commitment to give back. I think it's the most important thing we can do.
Yeah, the movie, The Social Media, if anyone here hasn't seen it, it's such a powerful social dilemma. Social dilemma is important. So no book, no app, no video game about gratitude, but practice it. I know my daughter has her children, share it. They at the table every day say, what am I grateful for today? Just to try to start that pattern in. I just wonder if, yeah.
I've actually must confess I have not thought about writing a children's book. I don't know. I'll have to think about whether or not I have one of those in me. But anyway, thanks for the suggestion.
Thank you. We have just 3 more questions and then we are going to wrap it up.
Okay.
Chuck, do you want to unmute and ask your question directly? It sort of follows with some of the things that we're talking about just now.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll start with 3 thanks. One, to you for your sermon this morning, particularly that contrast you drew between thinking of gratitude as a feeling and thinking of gratitude as a decision. My thanks to Lenore for asking the question she just asked, because it directly addressed what's on my mind. And my thanks to you, Galen, for agreeing to do this. You have a side effect of this that you wouldn't know is that a very dear friend of my wife, Donna, and me is Ann Bradley. And Ann has spoken to me as we served on the board together and did various things over the years many times about her appreciation for you and what she's gotten out of her relationship with you. So thank you for being here. I've learned to be thankful for Zoom in enabling things like this that probably wouldn't have taken place without a pandemic.
Yes.
So the ability to engage in this conversation as opposed to just watching a sermon from afar has been very meaningful. And my question, if there's anything more to be added to it, has to do with the fact that my wife and I are in our 70s and our 2 children are in their 30s, raising 5 grandchildren who we are very actively involved with. And it's painful for us, I think, when we see our own children unable to get to a place of gratitude in their life as they're busily involved raising their own children, and trying to think of ways, how can we help expand their feelings of gratitude and appreciation for what's going on in their life without giving them parental sermons, because we're not parents talking to children anymore. We're parents talking to peers about commonly loved grandchildren. And I think it probably gets back to what you already said, which is do it, do it, do it. I think it has something to do with what Kathleen said about try to get beyond seeing gratitude as a feeling and knowing that that feeling isn't there, but can you encourage a decision? So this question is really for the 2 of you. Kathleen, since you're the one who drew the direct comparison this morning.
Thanks, Chuck. Kathleen, do you want to say anything initially?
Well, I do want to acknowledge that insight was not original, by the way. That was directly drawn from the book, because it was insightful for me about the ability to make a choice and to make a decision, which I find is, if left up purely to the feeling realm, then I don't always make the best choices. So yeah, I'm not really sure how to answer your question, other than the decision is what has made a difference to me.
I would only add that I think one of the hardest things for us to accept is when people we love make decisions that we know either are not good decisions or decisions that are less good than other options they have. And it's hard to accept, but I think one of the disciplines we have to practice is to recognize that people have a freedom to make choices on their own, and some of those choices aren't going to turn out well. And one of the benefits of being chronologically gifted is that you have enough experience to know when some of those decisions are being made. So I guess what I would say is this: I acknowledge the pain that represents, but I also recognize that those decisions aren't your responsibility any longer. They're the responsibility of the children's parents. And they will need to find in their own time and in their own way, their own path to living a life that has more of a sense of gratitude and reciprocity to it.
Thank you. And in the meantime, we'll just keep, when we're all together as a family or virtually together over Zoom as a family, just keep doing it.
Yeah.
3 times.
Yeah, sorry, I was a little distracted because I was trying to navigate the Zoom, but I really appreciate what Lenore just wrote about engaging in the gratitude education of children and grandchildren, and practice.
Yeah.
Showing by example. 2 more, and then we will close it out. let's see, Mary Beth, I think you had a question. Do you want to ask it directly, or just shall I read it? The question was about the hallmarks of generosity.
About what they are.
Yeah, I'm trying to get to the view. Mary Beth, are you still here? Because she might have had to leave. Let's go to Dominic. I think you have the last one, and if Mary Beth is still here, we'll circle back to her. Just a minute.
Okay. Are you ready for me?
Yes, go ahead. Thank you.
All right. Just a minute. I wasn't sure if that meant to hold. So thank you both to both the reverends for this opportunity, this conversation. I wanted to ask Reverend Guengerich, if I'm saying that right. So I have been actively trying to incorporate gratitude, and intellectually I get it as, you know, as an exercise. I have an insight timer mind bell that goes off 3 to 4 times an hour randomly to remind me to pause and be grateful. My challenge, and maybe you can provide some guidance, is where the rubber hits the road in the light of glaring inequality and injustice. I have immense bitterness towards the extreme wealth that is literally right around, which I do not share in, which is right around the corner from me. So when I'm jogging past mansions and things of that nature, and I am unemployed, and I have, you know, been up and down the income ladders in various permutations of my life, not to get too personal, but I'm just saying, do you have any guidance for how to overcome the visceral and favor the practical or intellectual? I don't know if I'm articulating this well,
Yeah.
but you know, that deep gut feeling one has in wanting to shake your fist. You know, I read the only thing that you get when you shake your fist are dirty looks at a sore shoulder, right? Like, but you know, beyond that, how does one, like, you know, is there a hack for overcoming that and being able to raise yourself up? I'm not destitute, and I realize that life situations are relative. And, you know, by some measures, I'm doing very well. But still, it kind of, knowing that I can't get the same, you know, my work, as you talked about earlier, you know, all these things are needed. My last job was as a bartender, and I sat there while a white collar worker complained because he was only able to carry over 2 weeks of his 5 weeks vacation instead of 3 weeks because his employer made a change. And I'm like, you know, how do you stay grateful in the light of those kinds of inequities?
Well, that's a very good question, Dominic, and thank you for asking the question and for sharing your anger, pain, frustration, which I think in some ways or in different ways, all of us share at some level. I guess I would just say 2 things. One is that living with gratitude doesn't mean that we have to feel grateful for everything that confronts us in life. There are some things in life that are abhorrent, that are moral travesties. And it's worth remembering that not too long before Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote those words about gratitude, he and some other people tried to kill someone who they thought was an abomination on the earth. So living with gratitude isn't about feeling in a particular way all the time. It's about recognizing that we are here, we are in this culture, and we have an opportunity to react in certain ways to the situations we're in, to move the pendulum just a little bit more toward a world that's more truthful, more beautiful, more peaceful, more just. And often we can't do a lot, but we can do something. So living with gratitude is not about feeling that it's okay for these huge disparities to exist. And it's not about feeling thankful for people who have perpetrated them. But it is about recognizing that to be here at all is an opportunity, and that our challenge is to do what we can with what we have in the time that we have to make the world a better place. That's the challenge.
And I would add about the spiritual practice of gratitude for oneself. I was recalling a wise teacher once said, there's three useless things: judging, comparing oneself with others, and having to know why. And when I judge another or compare myself to them, I always find myself getting in trouble.
Yeah.
So we have one last question, and that's from Mary Beth, who is on the phone, and then we'll wrap up. Mary Beth, do you want to ask your question? You were asking about the hallmarks of gratitude. Can you say a little bit more about that? And you're muted right now. Ask to unmute.
*6.
There
Yes. Yes. Thank you for this. I did take the opportunity to look at the preview of the book, and I was struck by the fact that hallmarks of gratitude are an important way that you structured the book. So I just wanted to hear a little bit of what they are and how they can help us think about gratitude.
Thank you, Mary Beth. I would say that the hallmarks of gratitude are sort of the foundational principles of living, that they're how I understand the world to work, not just for human beings, but for all life. And that may be less obvious when I just read the list than I think hopefully it is when you see how I talk about them in the book. But so the basic principles that I think to some extent govern life and certainly enable us to live a fulfilling and meaningful and joyful life are: gratitude connects everything, gratitude emphasizes relationships, gratitude requires reciprocity, gratitude creates beauty, gratitude maximizes dignity, and gratitude seeks possibility. And each one of those hallmarks has an associated gratitude goal that I also talk about. So to me, it's just about a way of understanding how the world is made up and what our role is within it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And hearing you say that makes me even more excited to get the book. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
Well, I just want to thank you, Galen, so much for spending this time with us, for writing this beautiful book, which has been so inspiring, and sharing some of your story with us and your thoughts with us.
Well, thank you so much, Kathleen. It's been a pleasure and an honor. It's wonderful to see you all. And I hear a lot about your congregation, only partly when people are confusing us with you. But it's great to be with you and to talk with you. And I look forward to more at some point. So happy Thanksgiving to all of you. And Kathleen, thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you. All right. Take care, everyone. Blessings.
Okay. Bye-bye.